Carl Jung once wrote a line that still causes many psychologists to pause when they read it. A tree that reaches toward heaven must have roots that descend into hell. But Jung also understood something he rarely stated outright. When a person has gone deep enough into their own darkness, they do not return the same. They return with a different structure. And it is precisely this change that makes the people around them uneasy. If you are someone who has stayed silent in moments when you should have spoken, if you are someone who routinely carries other people's emotions, keeps the peace, endures so that everything does not fall apart, if you have ever been seen as too kind, too sensitive, too easily hurt, then there is something important that needs to be said clearly, right now. What is happening to you is not retaliation. It is also not becoming bitter or closed off. This is an inner restructuring, where the parts of you that once made you vulnerable are being placed into their proper position. The wounded version of you was never your true self. It was a state, a survival phase. And the version that is preparing to return is no longer built on endurance. What is coming next in your life does not resemble the gentle, healing stories people often tell. It is not loud, not violent, but it is strong enough to unsettle relationships that once relied on your silence in order to exist. Those who once hurt you misunderstood something fundamental. They believed the wound was your nature. They assumed that weaker version was who you truly were. Jung did not. He recognized that there are phases in life where silence is not surrender. It is observation. Withdrawal is not failure. It is preparation. While they believed you were collapsing, you were in what Jung called the cocoon stage. And what is about to frighten them is that you are not returning to explain, to forgive, or to prove anything. You are returning with something they can no longer reach, a whole self-conscious, grounded, and no longer asking permission. And once this journey has begun, you cannot return to the old way, even if you wanted to. There is something most of the people who hurt you never realized, not because they were cruel, but because they never looked deeply enough. They saw your silence and called it surrender. They saw your withdrawal and called it failure. They saw your lack of reaction and assumed they had won. But they completely misread that moment, because there are forms of silence that have nothing to do with submission. There is the silence of someone who is observing. There are forms of withdrawal that are not about escape, but about gathering data. Throughout the time you were hurt, abandoned, misunderstood, you did not lose yourself. You were recording. You recorded how they said one thing and did another. You recorded how they only appeared when they needed you, then disappeared when you needed them. You recorded apologies that were never followed by change. You recorded glances, tones of voice, and very small details that others overlooked. But you did not speak, not because you did not see, but because at that time, speaking was not yet safe. And then, a very subtle moment occurs, the moment Jung called the turning point. When the same pattern repeats often enough, the mind no longer interprets it as an isolated incident. It begins to see structure. You stop asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" And you begin to see, "Oh, this is how they operate." That is the moment everything shifts. And no one tells you that. The cost will be collected later, not immediately, not loudly, but unmistakably. While they think you are slowly disappearing, you are entering what Jung called the dark night of the soul. From the outside, it looks like collapse, but on the inside, it is restructuring. Like a caterpillar being seen as weak because it cannot yet fly. No one looks at a cocoon and assumes wings are forming inside. Everyone who once treated you poorly made the same mistake. They believed the wound was your identity. They thought you were the person of that pain. Jung did not. He recognized that there are people who only begin to become themselves after every old structure has fallen apart. And when they return, they do not return softer. They return more precise, clearer, no longer reacting from old instincts. You no longer absorb everything. You no longer ask yourself what you did wrong. You no longer try to understand people who never intended to understand you. Your silence now is not because of fear. It is because you have seen enough. And here is what most people never anticipate. When someone has observed long enough in silence, they do not return to argue. They return, and none of the old tactics can reach them anymore. This is where the story begins to enter a phase very few people are ready to face. There is a very specific moment that occurs after that silent period, not when you become stronger, but when the people around you begin to feel uneasy. You do not speak more. You do not explain. You are simply different. And that very difference exposes a truth that was previously concealed by your endurance. Jung called this phenomenon the mirror effect. When you were still absorbing everything, you were like a sponge. Others threw their emotions, their faults, their anger, their manipulation at you, and it disappeared. No one had to look at themselves. But when you stop absorbing, you become a mirror, not a mirror that attacks, but a mirror that reflects. For the first time, when they say something dishonest, you do not react, yet they hear the falseness in their own words. When they attempt to manipulate, you do not explain, and they realize the game no longer has a player. When they project guilt, you do not accept it, and that guilt turns back toward them. This is deeply uncomfortable for people who are accustomed to living unconsciously, because most toxic behavior cannot survive without someone to absorb it. Jung observed a very consistent reaction at this stage: escalation. When they can no longer control you using the old methods, they try harder. They may return very sweetly. They revisit old memories. They say that you have changed, that you are no longer yourself. But this is the crucial question Jung asked. Do they miss you, or do they miss the version of you they could control? Because if they truly cared about you, your growth would make them feel safe, not afraid. When sweetness no longer works, escalation turns into guilt. After everything I've done for you, you're so ungrateful. You're hurting me. And if guilt no longer works either, some people shift into the victim role, or anger, or speaking badly about you behind your back. Jung was not surprised by this. He wrote that, when a relationship is built on unconscious participation, one person withdrawing from their old role will be experienced as betrayal. But the truth is this: you did not betray them. You simply stopped betraying yourself. And here is the critical psychological turning point. You begin to see patterns instead of isolated behaviors. You see that, when you no longer explain, they need you to explain. When you no longer react, they need you to react. When you no longer ask permission, they feel a loss of power. This is not because you became cruel. It is because you became unmanipulable. Jung called this the first sign of shadow integration. Not becoming a bad person, but no longer abandoning the strong part of yourself. You do not attack. You do not retaliate. You simply remain steady within yourself. And for those who relied on your self-doubt in order to survive, that steadiness is more frightening than any outburst of anger, because for the first time, they have nowhere to hide from themselves. And from here on, the story is no longer about them. It becomes about you learning how to live, without making yourself smaller. After the mirror effect appears, a deeper shift begins to unfold, quiet, but irreversible. You begin to realize that the issue was never just a few specific people. It was an entire system that had grown accustomed to operating through your self-sacrifice. Family, work, close relationships. All of them had a place reserved for you. No one said it out loud, but the role was very clear. You were the peacemaker, the understanding one, the one who doesn't make a big deal, the one who carries emotional responsibility for the whole group. Jung called this an unconscious role within the collective structure. While you remained in that role, everything appeared fine, not because the system was healthy, but because you were absorbing all the pressure. But when you change, The system begins to shake. You can feel it clearly. No one has to say a word. The atmosphere in gatherings becomes unfamiliar. Jokes that once felt natural suddenly stall halfway through. There are glances that linger longer than necessary. There are silences that appear the moment you enter the room, not because you did anything wrong, but because you are no longer doing what you used to do. Jung observed that when an individual stops regulating emotion for the collective reacts like a body thrown out of balance. At first, there is discomfort, then resistance. Finally, attempts to bring everything back to how it was. You may hear things like, "You've really changed lately. I don't know why you've become like this. You weren't like this before." These statements are not observations. They are distress signals from the old system. Because the old version of you had a function, the new version is not easy to use. Jung called this the moment when the true self begins to collide directly with the collective persona. The persona is not only an individual mask, it is also the mask of the group. The family needs you weak, so they do not have to face their own issues. The workplace needs you to endure so toxic structures do not collapse. Some relationships need you silent, so imbalance can continue to exist. When you no longer hold that role, the truth begins to surface, and not everyone is ready to see it. This is when many empaths feel guilt return, not because they have done something wrong, but because they can sense the instability around them. You may find yourself asking, "Am I causing trouble? Am I being too selfish? Should I soften again?" Jung warned very clearly about this stage. He said, "This is the most dangerous point in the maturation process. Not because you will become a victim again, but because you may be pulled back through compassion that has no structure. The difference now is this. You see it. You see that every time you stand firm, someone else has to carry what they once pushed onto you, and that makes them uncomfortable. But here is the truth," Jung emphasized. "That discomfort is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that you have stopped doing work that was never yours. You did not break the family. You did not destroy the relationship. You simply exposed what had been fractured for a long time. And from this point on, the journey is no longer about how to make them understand you. It becomes a deeper question. Are you willing to live truthfully, even if it causes the collapse of structures that once depended on your sacrifice? That is where the true return begins. When the old system can no longer keep you in your familiar position, a stronger reaction emerges. Jung called this the escalation phase. Not escalation through violence, but through emotion. Those who once relied on your silence begin to change tactics. If before they ignored you, now they appear wounded. If before they controlled through pressure, now they control through guilt. You may hear things like, "After everything I've done for you, family is supposed to be like this. You've changed, you're not like you used to be anymore." Jung emphasized, this is not dialogue. This is an attempt to restore the old order. The system does not want you back out of love. It wants you back for your function. And if you are perceptive, you will notice a very important detail. The emotions they express at this stage are not meant to connect, but to pull you back into the role of regulating them. This is when empaths often waver the most, because you can still feel their pain. You can still sense their panic. You can still hear the insecurity beneath their accusations. But this time, there is a crucial difference. You no longer dissolve into it. You see their emotions, but you no longer identify yourself with those emotions. Jung called this the moment when sensation separates from responsibility. Before, when someone was sad, you felt you had to fix it. When someone was angry, you felt you had to soothe them. When someone was disappointed, you felt you had to change yourself. Now, you do not. You still feel, but you no longer act because of that feeling. This creates a very strange reaction in old relationships. The other person begins to feel disoriented. They speak, but you do not explain. They cry, but you do not rush in to rescue. They get angry, but you do not defend yourself. Your calm unsettles them more than conflict ever could. Jung recognized that in relationships built on emotional dependence, structured silence is the most frightening thing of all. Not cold silence, but silence that can no longer be pulled into. At this stage, many empaths begin to see a difficult truth. Not everyone wants you well. Some people only want you familiar, and the familiar version of you is the version that knows how to endure. This is when a new boundary forms, not through words, but through energy. You no longer explain why you need space. You no longer negotiate for respect. You no longer have to prove that your feelings are valid. You simply remain where you are. Jung called this the emergence of the inner center, a place within you that is no longer pulled back and forth by other people's reactions. And when this center forms, something very clear happens. Those who were attached to you only for emotional benefit will gradually drift away or be pushed out. Not because you reject them, but because they can no longer find what they needed in you. As for relationships with a healthy foundation, they will either adjust or reveal that they were never as healthy as you believed. This is not isolation. This is restructuring. Jung said that at this stage, individuals often feel both relieved and empty. Relieved because they are no longer being stretched thin. Empty because no one is defining them anymore. But it is precisely that emptiness where something new is about to take shape. Not a role, not an obligation, but the true self, for the first time, having space to exist. And from here, the journey moves into an even deeper layer. As relationships built on dependency begin to fall away, another phase emerges, quieter, but far deeper. Jung called this the stage of facing the void. No one is pulling you into drama anymore. No one is dumping their emotions onto you. No one needs you to keep their system running. And for the first time in a long while, you are alone not because you were abandoned, but because you are no longer being used. This moment confuses many empaths, because the silence does not only come from the outside. It appears on the inside. No more reflex to rush in and fix things. No more feeling that you have to do something to deserve staying. No more constant noise of other people's needs. There is only you. Jung wrote that this is when many people panic and turn back. Not because of suffering, but because they no longer know who they are without a role. For many years, you existed as a function, the understanding one, the enduring one, the one who kept everything from breaking. When those functions disappear, the old ego has nothing left to hold on to, and a very difficult question begins to arise, even if no one asks it aloud. If I am no longer needed by anyone, who am I? This is where many empaths once misunderstood the process. They thought this emptiness was depression. They thought this quiet feeling was wrong. They thought they were regressing. And crosser. Trivenda 7, but Jung saw the opposite. He said, "This is the beginning of true individuation, because only when you are no longer filled by other people's expectations can you hear your own voice. At first, that voice is very small. It does not speak in grand terms. It does not offer goals or missions. It only whispers very simple things. I don't like this. I need rest. I don't want to continue this relationship. I want to be still." For many empaths, these statements were once labeled selfish. Now, they become a compass. Jung called this the formation of inner will, not the will to control others, but the capacity to stay with your own choice, even when no one confirms it. This phase is often accompanied by a very particular kind of loneliness. Not loneliness from lack of people, but loneliness from no longer dissolving. You can still be among a crowd, but you no longer lose yourself in it. You can still listen, but you no longer turn yourself into a container. And this is what allows certain new people to enter your life. Not those who need you to save them, but those who do not require your sacrifice in order to stay close. They do not demand explanations. They do not need you to always be available. They do not expect you to regulate their emotions. Their presence does not drain you. It respects you. Jung said that relationships like these can only appear after an individual has withdrawn their energy back to their own center. Before that, you attract those who need you. Afterward, you attract those who recognize you. And this is a crucial shift. You no longer seek connection to fill a void. You begin to allow connection to enter only if it fits. The initial emptiness, the very thing that once frightened you, now becomes living space. Space to choose. Space to refuse. Space to feel without being pulled under. Jung called this a return to one's own axis. And once that axis is stable, something else begins to happen, not externally, but in the way you see yourself. This is where the journey moves into its next phase. When the inner axis has stabilized, a subtle yet decisive change begins to appear in how you perceive yourself. Not through praise, not through roles, not through whether or not you are still useful to someone. For the first time, your value no longer comes from other people's reactions. Jung called this moment the withdrawal of projection. For many years, you unconsciously saw yourself through the eyes of your environment. If they were pleased, you felt okay. If they were disappointed, you felt wrong. If they left, you felt deficient. Now, that structure begins to collapse, not because you have become indifferent, but because you no longer use the external gaze as an internal measure. You come to realize a truth that is uncomfortable, yet deeply liberating. Most of the guilt you carried did not come from doing something wrong, but from no longer doing what others expected of you. And when you stop punishing yourself for that, a new source of energy begins to return. Energy once consumed by guessing intentions, by adjusting yourself, by anticipating other people's emotions. Now, that energy becomes presence. You are in a conversation without trying to manage it. You listen without preparing a response. You speak when there is something real to say, and remain silent when there is not. Jung recognized that at this stage, the individual no longer reacts. They respond. Reaction comes from fear of losing connection. Response comes from inner stability. The difference may seem small, but its consequences are profound. Those who were accustomed to triggering you begin to fail. They no longer see you explaining. They no longer see you defending. They no longer see you trying to be understood. That confuses them, because their power never came from real strength, but from their ability to make you doubt yourself. When that doubt disappears, the old bond loses its pull. Jung called this the dissolution of unconscious dynamics. No conflict required. No dramatic rupture. It simply has nothing left to attach to. And at the same time, you begin to feel something very strange. You no longer need to be validated as right. Before, you needed others to confirm that you were not bad, not selfish, not wrong. Now, you can allow others to misunderstand you without collapsing. Not because you dismiss them, but because you no longer trade yourself for approval. Jung saw this as one of the clearest signs of psychological maturity. The immature person needs to be understood in order to exist. The integrated person can exist even when they are not understood. This completely changes how you move through the world. You no longer enter spaces asking, "Who do I need to be to fit in?" You enter with the quiet of someone who already has a place inside. Not performative, not closed off, simply clear. And that clarity begins to reshape the remaining relationships. Those who are capable of respecting boundaries feel safer around you. Those who require ambiguity to manipulate feel uneasy and gradually withdraw. Not because you push them away, but because you are no longer a place where they can hide from themselves. Jung wrote that when a person reaches this point, they no longer live to avoid conflict, but to avoid betraying their inner axis. And from here, a new question arises, not about others, but about your own life. If I am no longer living to please anyone, What will I use this life for? That question opens the door to the next stage. When that question appears, it does not arrive as a plan. It arrives as a space where old reflexes no longer operate automatically. You no longer wake up with the sense that you must do something for someone. You are no longer pulled by the fear of disappointing others. For the first time, your inner life becomes quiet. Jung called this stage conscious withdrawal, not escaping the world, but temporarily no longer being governed by it. Before, every decision you made had an invisible pull behind it. If I say this, what will they think? If I choose that, who will be hurt? If I don't show up, who will miss me? Now, those questions do not disappear completely, but they no longer hold authority. You begin to sense a different kind of responsibility. Not responsibility for other people's emotions, but responsibility to your inner truth. And that truth is not loud. It does not pressure you. It simply waits to be heard. At this stage, many empaths panic, because when you are no longer pulled by other people's needs, you are forced to face a very raw question. What do I truly want when no one needs me? At first, the answer may be, I don't know. And that uncertainty makes many people want to return to their old role. At least that role gave them a sense of familiarity. But Jung observed this. If you can tolerate this not knowing, it does not last. From that empty space, small signals begin to appear. Not grand ambition, not dramatic purpose, just very subtle inclinations. You notice that certain conversations make you feel more awake, that certain kinds of work no longer drain you, that certain environments allow you to breathe more deeply, and most importantly, you begin to choose, no longer driven by the instinct to rescue, no longer feeling the need to be everywhere. Jung called this the shaping of personal will, a will that does not come from an ego trying to prove itself, but from a self that feels safe enough not to prove anything. This clearly changes how you act in the world. You no longer engage in endless arguments, not because you lack an opinion, but because you no longer need to win. You no longer over-explain, not because you are cold, but because you trust that truth does not need to be forced into understanding. You begin to ask yourself before every commitment, will this pull me off my axis? If the answer is yes, you decline without drama, without guilt. For many people around you, this is the moment they realize you have not simply changed, you have shifted into a different operating level. No longer predictable, no longer easily triggered, no longer easily pulled back into old roles. Jung wrote that when an individual reaches this stage, they begin to live no longer from reaction, but from conscious choice. And this leads to a very important consequence. You begin to restructure your life, not from pain, but from clarity. You no longer build your life to compensate for the past. You build it to fit who you are now, not loudly, not for anyone's approval, simply aligned. And from that foundation, a very different kind of strength begins to form. Not strength to fight the world, but strength to stand steady within it. That is what leads into the next phase. When you have stood in that state long enough, something very strange begins to happen. The external world starts to respond in reverse. Not through direct words, but through very subtle signals. Those who were accustomed to you always being present begin to feel a lack. Not a lack of you as a person, but a lack of the function you once fulfilled. You begin to notice messages that arrive without real content, carrying only one purpose, to pull you back. Questions that seem caring, but underneath are probes. Are you still the same as before? Jung called this the system's reaction when a link is removed. Every system has inertia, family, collectives, relationships, even social roles. When you change, the system does not change with you immediately. It will attempt to pull you back into the old position, not out of malice, but out of instability. You begin to see familiar patterns. Someone who once ignored you now appears nostalgic. Someone who once relied on you now becomes irritated. Someone who benefited from your silence now says you have changed. And here, a subtle test appears. Not a test of endurance, but a test of inner consistency. Before, when faced with another person's discomfort, you immediately adjusted yourself. You apologized. You explained. You soothed. Now, that reflex is no longer automatic, not because you are forcing yourself to resist, but because something else has formed inside you. Jung said that at this stage, if an individual returns to the old role to avoid conflict, they will feel more pain than before awakening, because now they know exactly what they are doing. You begin to realize this. Each time you betray your inner truth, your body reacts immediately. Tension, fatigue, heaviness. The truth no longer allows you to escape. This is when many empaths understand something crucial. The peace they now feel does not come from everyone being satisfied, but from no longer abandoning themselves. And this changes how you perceive loss. Before, losing a relationship meant failure. Now, you see clearly. Some relationships only exist when you erase yourself. When you stop doing that, they dissolve on their own. No arguments needed. No conclusions required. It simply no longer has any force holding it together. Jung called this natural separation. Not separation through violence, but through different levels of consciousness. You do not hate them. You do not need them to understand. You are simply no longer on the same frequency. What is striking is this. As old relationships fall away, other connections begin to appear. Not all at once, not dramatically, just people who can be present, without requiring you to brace yourself. Conversations that do not make you shrink, looks that do not demand proof of who you are. And for the first time, you experience a form of connection that is not built on sacrifice. Jung saw this as a sign that the individual has entered the stage of living from the true self, no longer needing to react in order to be accepted, no longer needing to perform in order to stay. You do not become better in a social sense, but you become more accurate to yourself. And from here, a final movement begins to take shape, no longer about healing, but about how you exist in the world. This is where the final part leads. And this is where the journey closes, not with a promise, but with a very quiet truth. You do not become someone else. You stop abandoning yourself. Carl Jung once said that the greatest privilege of a human life is to become who one truly is. Not the pleasant version, not the praised version, but the version that does not have to fragment itself in order to survive. If you have made it this far, you may recognize something difficult to name. You no longer need to be understood, not because you are cold, but because you have stopped placing yourself as a sacrifice for other people's comfort. This return is not loud, not victorious, not announced. It is simply that each morning you wake up, you no longer have to put on an old role. You choose silence, not out of fear, but because there is nothing left to prove. You choose to say no, not to hurt others, but to stop hurting yourself. And if someone feels uneasy around this version of you, remember this: they are not afraid of you. They are afraid of losing access to the version of you that was easy to control. Your calm is not indifference. It is the sign of an inner life that has found its axis. From here on, you will no longer be pulled back into the past by relationships that require you to shrink in order to survive. You will no longer explain why you have changed, and most importantly, you will no longer ask yourself whether you are allowed to live this way. You have always had that right, not because anyone granted it to you, but because you stopped giving it away. The empath's journey does not end with becoming strong. It ends at a very still point. You remain with yourself, and once you are there, there is no path back. even if you wanted to. Silence.